Today, let's talk about the absolutely incredible and true story of a 15th century knight. This is a man who faced what should have been a career-ending, life-shattering injury, and instead, he turned it into the very thing that made him a legend.
So here's the big question, right? For a warrior, a knight whose entire life and career is built on their skill with a sword, losing your dominant hand, well, that seems like game over. But for this one guy, it was really just the beginning.
Meet Götz von Berlichingen. Born way back in 1480, he was a German imperial knight living in this really fascinating time, right on the cusp between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And even before his life changed forever, he was already making a name for himself as a pretty formidable warrior.
But then, in a single moment, the entire path of his life was completely altered. And it all happened at a place called the Siege of Landshut.
Okay, so picture this. The year is 1504. Götz is in the heat of battle, and then, bam, a cannon blast changes everything. His right hand, his sword hand, is gone. I mean, you can imagine what a devastating blow for any soldier, let alone a knight of his reputation.
And what's really interesting is that even today, historians aren't totally sure how it happened. One theory is pretty straightforward. Cannonball fragments hit his hand directly. But the other theory, it's way more dramatic. It suggests the blast hit his own sword with so much force that it drove the handle right through his arm. Either way, the result was the same.
Now, this is the point where most stories would probably end. But for Götz, this is where his legend is truly forged. He goes from this place of complete despair to an act of just incredible ingenuity.
And don't get me wrong, at first, he was absolutely crushed. He was overwhelmed. He really believed his life as a knight, as a warrior, was over. He just couldn't see a future for himself in the world he knew.
But then, something clicked. He had this memory of a servant from his father's house, a man who also only had one hand, but still managed to live a full, capable life. And that memory became this tiny spark of inspiration. You know, if that man could persevere, why couldn't he?
So he takes action. He completely refuses to accept his fate. Instead, he finds a local gunsmith and commissions something that was just revolutionary for the time, a custom-built, functional, prosthetic hand made entirely of iron.
And he didn't just stop at one. The first hand was already a marvel. It had a pretty simple button-operated grip, but it was detailed right down to wrinkles and fingernails. The second version, though, that was a true masterpiece of 16th century engineering. It had way more dexterity. It allowed him to grip a sword, hold a quill to write, and even control the reins of his horse.
So, with his new iron hand, Götz didn't just go back to his old life. No, he launched a whole new and even more notorious career. He became known as the Iron-Handed Knight.
And yeah, his new career was pretty far from a fairy tale knight in shining armor. He became a mercenary. We're talking about a guy who led countless campaigns, attacked merchant ships for treasure, and even kidnapped nobles to hold them for ransom. He was an absolute force to be reckoned with.
And his post-injury career spanned decades. I mean, look at this. In 1525, he was fighting in the Peasant War. Almost 20 years later, in 1542, he's battling against the Turks in Hungary. And then just 2 years after that, he's fighting for Emperor Charles V against the French. The man's fighting days were far from over.
So in the end, his injury didn't define his end. It actually defined his legacy. It was his incredible courage, his fierce determination, and just his sheer perseverance that made him one of the most memorable and impressive knights of the entire era.
And that legacy, it didn't just end on the battlefield. It has lasted for centuries, cemented by his remarkable life and the incredible artifacts he left behind.
He died in 1562 at the age of 82. Just think about that for a second. For a guy who lived a life of constant, brutal warfare, who survived countless battles and a really severe injury, living to be 82 back then was absolutely extraordinary.
And his story isn't just some old legend. It's history that you can actually go and see today. Both of his iron hands, these incredible feats of engineering from the 1500s, are on display at the Hornburg Museum in Germany. A direct, physical link to the iron-willed knight himself.
You know, the story of Götz von Berlichingen leaves us with a pretty powerful question. He took what should have been his greatest weakness and literally forged it into his most iconic strength. It really makes you wonder, how can we transform our own setbacks into the very things that define us?